Hey, Cypher here. You ever heard that phrase, like, people who've made it into history? You know, making it, which is a really weird term. I've even had commenters say, like, you can't say anything bad about this guy because he made history. You only write history. It's like, well, writing history is making history. Whoever that guy is only makes it into history. It's still my name on the book. But there is something deeper to get at here than just, you know, only the great people make it into history, blah, 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 blah. Or only the victors write the history. Well, if victors only wrote the history, then why the heck is the second historian one of the losers writing about the losing side of a war? I don't really have patience for that phraseology because it justifies a lot of stupidity. Like, you'll see a lot of lost causers trying to say, well, the victors write the history, so that's why our side never gets heard. We hear your side a lot, and it really ought to not be heard as much. So both of those kinds of phrases are actually extremely misleading and promulgate a lot of bad ideas. But there is an underlying thing to both of them, and it's that history is made in a certain way that gets certain voices taken away. For instance, you can't tell your story if you're dead. Dead men tell no tales. So in that sense, I guess it makes sense that victors write the history, but once again, that phrase is incredibly misleading. A better phrase is survivor bias, and there's a historical way of understanding it. I don't know how true the story is, but people use this story to explain it plenty. So the story goes that people were looking at World War II bombers and how to reinforce them for dealing with flak. And so they were seeing where all the holes were when planes came back and decided to reinforce those areas. The problem was, those planes came back. The ones that crashed because of flak were obviously not coming all the way back home. So they were making decisions on where to reinforce armor according to survivor bias. Now, I don't know how true that story is, but it makes a pretty good case, because you can talk about that with just documentation. You know, think about what makes good history and everything is you need to have good documentation for it. But if you have no documentation, well, then there's no history to be made. But even when there are documents, there's even more ways that survivor bias creeps in. Because we have this whole thing called great man theory, where basically people are looking at, like, the coolest, biggest, most important events, and then they kind of miss everything else. By focusing on the biggest events, we miss out on the smaller stuff. You know, why do we need another biography of Abraham Lincoln when there's so many other people to write biographies about? And this is where we get to historical theory, because there's ways of fighting this whole thing that historians have been trying to come up with over the years, starting with a guy named Antonio Gramsci. A Marxist! Ah! So he took a term called the Subaltern and brought it into his own idea of cultural hegemony. So this is going to take a bit of explanation, and I don't have a lot of time to do it. The basic concept of hegemony in general is somebody having power over somebody lower than them. Hegemony, or a hegemon, is somebody who controls somebody else. Cultural hegemony is when some overriding power controls the culture. Now, Gramsci, he wasn't an historian. He was actually talking about a bunch of Italian communists and anarchists and socialists and whatnot, but he was saying that they were bickering amongst themselves because there was this cultural hegemony that was making them not get along, basically. Now, you gotta understand, he wasn't saying that there was like some big power controlling everything, pulling the strings. Instead, he was saying that there was like a superstructure that basically everyone believed that they were the cultural authorities. It's not that it was some sort of conspiracy or anything, but literally just that the culture itself had vested power in these people. So this cultural hegemony pushes people to the side, the people who couldn't fit into the system or were so subjugated that they weren't really given a voice. This is what he termed the subaltern. Now, him being a Marxist, of course, he was trying to say that, like, we need to teach these people that they are an oppressed class and everything, basically that whole concept of class consciousness, and that this cultural hegemony was suppressing class consciousness. That's called praxis, and we don't really need to talk about it because we're not talking about Marxist history here. We're talking about cultural hegemony and subaltern studies. So how do you think that would apply to things that aren't just Marxist related? Well, that's when we get to race, class, and gender. The idea is that the culture elevates particular voices, such as white, straight, cis males, that's way too many words to say at once, to be the hegemonic figure, that they are literally in control of the culture because the culture has foisted that control upon them because they are the ones in power. So those not given a voice are the subaltern. So the idea is, how do we raise these voices, the subaltern voices, to the surface? So luckily in modern times we have pretty good documentation from everyone, since, you know, everybody kind of leaves a paper trail nowadays. And so historians are going and looking at these subalterns and seeing how history might have been viewed through their eyes. So in a way, they're trying to bring people who were outside the fold of history into it by using these kinds of advanced theories. It also substantially changes the way that we view history as a whole, because suddenly it's not just about the great men who did great things, but also the people they were oppressing. But actually, this is kind of spreading the definition of subaltern, because there's a bit of it that really shouldn't be possible to raise to the surface. All of this stuff is called postcolonialism, and probably the most famous postcolonial author was Gayatri Spivak. Spivak wrote a paper aptly named "Does the Subaltern Speak?" And her ultimate conclusion was no. That as soon as we have voices to elevate, they are no longer subaltern. That we are elevating people to, history, to be in the fold of history, but there's a layer below that. Her prime example was sati, these women who would basically throw themselves on the flames of their husbands' funeral pyres. Now, there's a lot of dispute as to how often this was and whether it was coerced more often than not and all that kind of stuff. It's a huge historical debate in that. But Spivak was getting at whether or not these women's voices could be elevated. And she was kind of cutting that Gordian knot of, was it coerced? How often did it happen? And all that kind of stuff. She was saying, we cannot know, because ultimately their voices cannot be heard. They are subject to the superstructure too much. They are fully controlled by cultural hegemony. So whether or not they said they were coerced doesn't really matter. Ultimately, we cannot know, because the entire culture is pushing in upon them. So there are people who are left out of history and cannot be recovered. So yeah, theory needs to advance as we come to terms with the reality that, people get left out of history. Plus there's the known unknowns, as in things that we know that we've lost documentation on. For instance, there's a lot of times that we know that an author wrote something because it's quoted in another book or something along those lines, and it's been just lost to the ravages of time. You see this a lot in ancient history. Sometimes these things have been recovered from things like papyrus dumps and whatnot, but unfortunately, we know a lot of stuff has been lost. And then there's just the unknown unknowns, as in the things that we don't even know that we've lost. I mean, when you have some big city fire and the records from a given time frame get lost, a lot of the time we have no idea what's in those records, so we can't even guess. Let alone ancient burnings like the Library of Alexandria. probably the greatest loss of knowledge we've ever faced as a species. And even today, museums are often getting closed and then they'll like sell their collections, which by the way is incredibly unethical, but boards kind of force them to do it. The museum profession really needs to get a hold of how they deal with museum closure, but actually having written a little bit about it and tried to submit it, they are incredibly apprehensive of dealing with the issue. It is a very touchy subject. And yet, this leads to a great loss of information, the thing that history is built upon. Without those artifacts, without those records, and if they get sold off and then get lost in the ether, it's lost to historians. We can't recover it. Those people are gone. So how do we deal with this whole problem? Well, first, not knowing something doesn't mean give up. I see so many comments being like, well, history is written by the victor, so why even try? Like, those are stupid comments and incredibly ignorant. Just because you don't know something doesn't mean you give up on it. Second, just always have this in the back of your mind if you're writing history, you know? Like, think there is some part of the story that I simply cannot know. Third, understand this is how truth works. It's not some static object for us to achieve. It has to be built. It has to be constructed. That's why I like the pragmatic definition of truth so much, because it allows truth to change. It's not just some static thing that, if you don't have it, then nothing's true. Correspondence theory doesn't allow for that. If correspondence theory is simply truth equals reality, then if you have one thing wrong, then you don't have the truth. Whereas the pragmatic definition allows there to be a current truth and an absolute truth. And we're just trying to get to that. We may never achieve it. It requires an infinite amount of time and discussion amongst rational inquirers, but eventually you get closer and closer. Truth evolves over time. And fourth, we have to keep on coming up with concepts like cultural hegemony, subaltern studies, and all of that kind of stuff to be able to elevate these voices that were left out, to be able to compare and contrast and bring out things that we know have been lost. So we have to advance our methodology. That whole idea that history is some sort of objective truth is really old hat, if not something that really was never present to begin with. If you want to know more about that, I recommend this book by Peter Novick called That Noble Dream. Although I have to warn you, in my class we called this That Noble Doorstop, because, it was pretty boring. But it talks about the general acceptance of subjectivity in history. Because the fact is, we have to advance our methods, and in order to do so, we have to accept that history is not objective. Generally, the people who are trying to push that, history is objective and whatnot, are the same people who are trying to push great man theory, orthodoxy, basically all that stuff that the history profession has gotten better and better by moving away from. And we cannot come to terms with the fact that people get left out of history if we keep on pretending that history is objective. Thucydides, right next to Caesar. Where is that noble doorstop? Hated reading this book, but it's important. Damn it. Wow, I am sweating so much that it's going down my back. Gross. That's good rye.